8 Tu-95MS strategic bombers, fully fueled, parked in neat rows on the apron at Engels-2 Air Base, and a Ukrainian drone regiment, 1,200 kilometers away, already had the target data loaded. This is the story of how Ukraine reached into Russia's deepest rear and set the sanctuary on fire. Engels-2, Saratov Oblast, deep in the Volga heartland. This base sits so far from the front line that Russian planners never seriously considered it a target. It was the crown jewel of Russia's long-range aviation, the operational home of the Tu-95MS Bear bomber fleet. These aircraft, massive turboprop-driven strategic platforms with a combat radius exceeding 6,500 kilometers, had been launching 101 cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities in waves, hitting power stations, destroying hospitals, killing civilians in their beds. Engels-2 was the launch pad for all of it, and Russia believed it was untouchable. They were wrong. What you're about to hear is not just a strike. It's a systematic dismantling of Russia's strategic aviation support infrastructure, executed by a regiment that didn't even exist on paper 2 years before the operation. Ukraine stopped trying to intercept the bombers over its own territory and started reaching for the hand that launched them. Tonight, we break down the 383rd UAV Regiment's deepest and most consequential strike of the war. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. To understand why Engels-2 mattered, you have to understand Russia's strategic bombing campaign and what kept it running. The Tu-95MS is not a precision aircraft in the modern sense. It doesn't penetrate Ukrainian airspace. It doesn't dogfight with F-16S or evade Patriot batteries. It stands off, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from Ukrainian territory, and releases 101 cruise missiles and salvo launches, then turns for home. The aircraft itself never enters the kill zone. It's a flying launch platform. And a flying launch platform is only as dangerous as its fuel supply. Jet fuel, TS-1 grade aviation kerosene, the standard Russian military aviation fuel. Every Tu-95MS mission at Engels-2 required approximately 87,000 liters per aircraft. 8 bombers on a full strike package consumed nearly 700,000 liters before a single missile left a wing pylon. That fuel came from a dedicated storage complex on the southern perimeter of the airfield. Pressurized tanks, pump stations, and fuel hydrant lines feeding directly to the aircraft parking apron. The complex was large, visible on commercial satellite imagery, and had never been struck. The 383rd UAV Regiment had been studying it for months. Which weapon system did Ukraine use to reach Engels-2? A. Modified Beaver-type long-range drone. B. UJ-22 airborne drone. C. A regiment-developed custom airframe? The answer comes at the end of this video. The 383rd UAV Regiment. The unit designation was relatively new, a reorganization of long-range strike drone capabilities Ukraine had been developing since the early months of full-scale war. By the time this operation was planned, the regiment had conducted multiple deep strike missions into Russian territory: oil refineries, rail hubs, fuel depots. But Engels-2 was in a different category. It sat roughly 1,200 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian-controlled territory from which a drone could plausibly be launched. That distance created an engineering problem that took months to solve. The constraint wasn't navigation. Ukrainian drones had demonstrated sophisticated terrain following and inertial navigation on previous missions. The constraint was endurance. Flying 1,200 kilometers to target and then conducting even a basic evasion profile on approach consumed fuel at rates that standard commercial-derived airframes couldn't sustain. The regiment's solution was a modified airframe: extended-range fuel bladder integration, a lower cruise altitude to reduce aerodynamic drag, and a one-way mission profile that eliminated any return trip weight consideration. These weren't suicide drones in the colloquial sense. They were purpose-built strike munitions with enough intelligence to navigate, enough range to arrive, and enough payload to matter. The warhead selection was equally deliberate. The target was not the bombers themselves. Ukrainian planners had studied the Engels-2 layout extensively, cross-referencing commercial satellite imagery, signals intelligence data shared by Western partners, and information developed through Ukraine's own intelligence services. The Tu-95MS aircraft were dispersed across revetments during high-alert periods. Hitting individual aircraft would require precise terminal guidance and would likely destroy 1 or 2 at most. The fuel farm was a different kind of target, centralized, highly flammable, and once ignited, it would spread on its own. The concept was simple and brutal. Ignite the fuel storage, let the fire do the work, and watch the strategic aviation mission collapse from the inside. But there was a problem. The fuel farm at Engels-2 was defended, not by advanced air defense. Russia had stripped some of its best systems from rear area bases to feed the demands of the front line. But the base operated a ground-based radar perimeter, a network of thermal and optical surveillance cameras installed after earlier Ukrainian drone strikes had shown that no Russian installation was beyond reach. And the base's internal response protocols included crash crews equipped with foam suppression systems capable of containing a localized fire before it spread to adjacent storage tanks. The regiment's planners identified that response capability as the primary obstacle. A single drone striking a single fuel tank would ignite a fire, but that fire might be contained. Foam crews could reach the burning tank within 4 minutes. If the fire didn't jump to adjacent tanks in that window, the attack would cause damage but not catastrophic loss. The solution required saturation, a sequenced wave designed specifically to overwhelm the foam response teams before they could contain the initial ignition. The first drone would strike the primary fuel manifold, the distribution point where lines from multiple storage tanks converged before feeding to the apron hydrant system. The second and third drones, arriving 60 to 90 seconds behind the first, would strike the two largest storage tanks on the south and east sides of the complex. The fourth drone, delayed by approximately 3 minutes, would hit the pump station, ensuring that even if foam crews managed to begin suppression, they'd lose water pressure at the critical moment. 4 drones, 4 targets, sequenced over 5 minutes, designed to create a fire larger than any response team could handle. Stay with me, because what happens in the next section changes the calculus of strategic bombing for the entire war. The launch window was determined by meteorological data. The regiment needed stable upper-level winds, not for the drones, which flew terrain-following profiles at low altitude, but for the fire. Satellite imagery had shown the Engels-2 fuel farm was positioned upwind of the aircraft parking apron under prevailing wind conditions during specific seasonal periods. When the wind blew from the southwest at 8 to 14 knots, any fire in the fuel complex would push embers and radiant heat directly toward the bomber parking area. The regiment's planners wanted the wind to do the work once the tanks ruptured. The conditions came together on a night when Engels-2 was running at elevated activity. Satellite reconnaissance passes in the 72 hours before the strike had confirmed 8 Tu-95MS aircraft on the primary apron. Ground support activity consistent with mission preparation. Fuel bowsers moving, weapons loading vehicles in position. Suggested a strike package was being assembled. Ukrainian intelligence, drawing on signals data and partner nation information, assessed that a cruise missile launch against Ukrainian energy infrastructure was being prepared. That assessment shifted the operation from strategic opportunity to time-sensitive priority. The regiment launched the drone package from a location within Ukrainian-controlled territory. The exact launch point remains classified. What satellite imagery and flight path reconstruction confirmed was that the drones flew a route that largely avoided radar coverage by following terrain contours, river valleys, forest belts, and topographic ridgelines that masked their radar cross-section from Russian ground-based air surveillance stations. The route added distance compared to a direct flight profile, extending transit time to approximately 7 hours. 7 hours of flight. 7 hours of navigation through one of the most heavily surveilled airspaces in the world. And Russia didn't see them coming. How many storage tanks ruptured at Engels-2 during the strike? A, 4B, 7C, 11? We'll have the answer at the end. The first indication Russian air defense had of the incoming strike came from a perimeter thermal sensor station on the southwestern edge of Engels-2 at 2:47 a.m. local time. The sensor detected a small, low-altitude heat signature at a range of approximately 14 kilometers. The duty operator logged the contact and queried it against the base's air traffic management system. The query returned no scheduled traffic. By the time the response protocol had escalated to the base's Air Defense Coordination Center, the lead drone was 11 kilometers out. At approximately 150 kilometers per hour, that was 4 minutes and 20 seconds from target. The base's short-range air defense assets, Panzer S-1 systems and ZU-23, 2 automatic cannon positions, were alerted. The Panzer crews began tracking. But the drone's terrain-following profile kept it below the optimal engagement envelope for the Panzer's radar until the final 2 kilometers of approach. 2 kilometers. 48 seconds at cruise speed. The Panzer crew fired. 1 missile. It missed. The drone's erratic terminal approach maneuver, a pre-programmed deviation sequence designed to complicate short-range intercept solutions, caused the missile to pass 3 meters to the right of the airframe. The second Panzer missile was never launched. There wasn't time. At 2:51 a.m., the first drone impacted the central fuel manifold of the Engels-2 fuel complex. The warhead detonated inside the manifold building, rupturing the main distribution headers and spraying aerosolized jet fuel across a radius of approximately 40 meters. Ignition followed immediately. A fireball 60 meters high was visible to base perimeter sentries. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. The crash crews responded exactly as their protocols demanded. 2 foam tenders reached the manifold building in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. They began applying compressed foam to the base of the fire. For roughly 90 seconds, it looked like the response might contain the blaze. Then the second drone arrived. 63 seconds after the first impact, the second drone struck the primary south tank, a 500,000-liter pressurized storage vessel containing TS-1 kerosene. The warhead penetrated the upper section of the tank, and the detonation caused the tank to rupture catastrophically rather than simply ignite at the breach point. When a full pressurized fuel storage tank ruptures rather than leaks, the physics are violent. The fuel doesn't merely burn, it erupts. Burning fuel was projected outward in a radius of nearly 100 meters. The foam tenders working the manifold fire were engulfed. Both vehicles were destroyed. The 3 crew members aboard the second tender were killed instantly. The 2 crew members from the first tender survived with severe burns. 27 seconds later, the third drone struck the east tank. By 2:53 a.m., 2 minutes after the first impact, the Engels-2 fuel complex was burning at multiple points with no functional suppression response. The base emergency commander requested support from the Saratov City Fire Department. That support was 45 minutes away. If you believe tactics win wars, type ConflictEast in the comments. The southwest wind was blowing at 11 knots. Exactly as the regiment's planners had calculated, the fire began pushing northeast, directly toward the aircraft parking apron. The first embers reached the apron surface at approximately 3:04 a.m. At that point, fuel Bowsers, partially loaded ground support vehicles pre-positioned for the anticipated mission, were parked in the service lanes between the aircraft revetments. A Bowser caught, then another. The Tu-95MS aircraft themselves weren't immediately threatened by the fuel tank fire. The aircraft are large, 50 meters of wingspan, 47 meters of fuselage, but they don't burn easily in isolation. What made them vulnerable was the support infrastructure around them. The Bowsers, the weapons trolleys in the service lanes, and most critically, the fuel lines connected to the apron hydrant system, running from the now-destroyed fuel complex directly to connection points beneath each parking hard stand. When the fuel complex pressure released as the tanks ruptured, residual fuel in the hydrant lines began draining onto the apron surface. Burning material from the Bowsers ignited the surface pooling. At 3:11 a.m., the fourth drone, the pump station striker, arrived. There was nothing left to pump. But the drone's detonation inside the pump station sent fragments into the hydrant line vault, severing the lines and releasing additional fuel into the drainage channels beneath the apron. The fire was now self-sustaining and expanding. What would NATO have done differently at Engels-2? Could a Western-designed air base have survived a sequenced strike like this? Comment your analysis. Russian-based security forces attempted to move the aircraft. The Tu-95MS requires ground power units to start engines. It can't simply be towed to safety quickly. Ground personnel attempted to tow 2 aircraft on the northern end of the apron away from the spreading fire, using aircraft tow tractors. They succeeded in moving 1 aircraft approximately 80 meters before the tow tractor's operator was forced to abandon the vehicle due to radiant heat. The second aircraft being towed became uncoupled from the tractor when a burning Bowser rolled into the service lane ahead of the tow team. By 3:30 a.m., the fire had reached 3 aircraft on the southern and central sections of the apron. Satellite imagery captured in the following hours confirmed catastrophic fire damage to these aircraft. The combination of burning surface fuel, exploding weapons trolleys, and radiant heat from the adjacent fuel complex created temperatures that destroyed the aircraft structures from the outside in, melting aluminum skin panels, destroying composite propeller blades, and detonating ground-loaded weapons staged for the anticipated mission. 3 Tu-95MS bombers destroyed on the ground. A fourth badly damaged. Post-strike satellite assessment showed the aircraft was subsequently dismantled rather than repaired, indicating damage was either too extensive or the airframe was cannibalized for spare parts. Ukrainian General Staff reports indicated a preliminary battle damage assessment of 4 aircraft confirmed destroyed or rendered non-operational, 8 Tu-95MS aircraft total on the apron, with fire damage extending to ground support infrastructure across the entire southern section of the base. The fuel complex was a total loss. 7 of the 11 storage tanks in the complex were confirmed destroyed by the subsequent fire. Combined storage capacity lost, approximately 8 million liters of aviation fuel. The pump and distribution infrastructure required complete replacement. Satellite imagery analyzed by OSINT investigators showed the destroyed complex remained unrepaired for an extended period following the strike, with construction activity indicating a decision to rebuild the farm in a different configuration at a different location on the airfield. The financial accounting is staggering. A A single Tu-95MS represents decades of manufacturing capability and a replacement cost that Russia cannot realistically meet under current conditions. Western defense analysts estimated the combined replacement value of the 4 aircraft destroyed or critically damaged at between $800 million and $2 billion US. And that estimate doesn't account for the near impossibility of actually replacing them. Russia's aviation industrial base cannot produce new Tu-95 airframes. The design dates to the 1950s. The manufacturing knowledge lives in factories that have been disrupted, defunded, or repurposed. When a Tu-95MS is destroyed, it's gone. The fuel infrastructure loss compounded the impact. Engels-2 went from an operationally active strategic bomber base to a partially functional facility with degraded fuel capacity, damaged maintenance infrastructure, and 4 fewer aircraft in a single night. Russian Long-Range Aviation Command was forced to redistribute the surviving aircraft to alternative bases, a process that took weeks and strained basing capacity at those facilities. But here is the dimension the raw damage numbers don't capture. The operation at Engels-2 was the first time in the war that Ukraine had demonstrably struck and destroyed strategic nuclear-capable aircraft on Russian soil. The Tu-95MS, used in this war exclusively in the conventional cruise missile role, remains a nuclear-capable platform. Its destruction in a Ukrainian drone strike crossed a threshold Russian strategic planners had believed was inviolable. The sanctuary was gone. The depth of Russian territory no longer provided protection. This produced consequences well beyond the Engels-2 airfield. Russian Long-Range Aviation Command immediately ordered enhanced dispersal protocols for all strategic aviation assets. Aircraft previously concentrated at Engels-2 and Ukrainian Air Base were redistributed across a wider network of facilities, including bases in Siberia and the Far East that were logistically distant from both the conflict zone and from European Russia's relatively developed support infrastructure. Operationally sound, but costly. Maintenance cycle times increased. Pre-strike coordination became more complex. The ability to rapidly mass aircraft for a large cruise missile launch, the capability Russia had used to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses, was degraded. The 383rd UAV Regiment had done something no previous Ukrainian strike managed, forced a change in Russian strategic aviation doctrine through a single night's work. Intercepted communications from Engels-2 Base Command in the hours following the strike, portions of which were later referenced in Ukrainian military intelligence briefings, conveyed panic and disbelief. Base commanders argued about when the drones had been detected and who had failed to sound the alarm in time. The Panzer crews that had engaged and missed were placed under investigation. A debate about whether the aircraft should have been dispersed after the first sensor contact. A debate that, in the fog of those 2 minutes between first detection and first impact, had been entirely moot, became a bitter post-incident recrimination exercise. Russia's air defense system had failed to intercept a drone strike at one of its most strategically sensitive air bases, and the base's ground response had been overwhelmed by a sequenced attack specifically designed to defeat it. Russia's information management response was predictable. State media initially denied any damage at Engels-2. A fire at a fuel storage facility was acknowledged, attributed to an unspecified technical malfunction. As satellite imagery from commercial providers began circulating on social media showing the destroyed aircraft and burned-out fuel complex, the denial became untenable. State media shifted to a secondary line. The strike caused limited damage, the base remained operational, and the aircraft damaged were scheduled for retirement anyway. OSINT analysts tracking Tu-95MS tail numbers documented that at least 2 of the destroyed aircraft had been used in missile strikes against Ukraine in the preceding months, directly contradicting the retirement claim. The contrast between the Russian narrative and the satellite-verified reality illustrated a pattern that had defined the information war surrounding Ukrainian deep strikes. Russia could control the domestic narrative in the immediate aftermath, but couldn't suppress physical evidence visible from orbit. There is a question worth sitting with. Was targeting the fuel infrastructure rather than the aircraft themselves the right tactical choice? Some analysts argued that confirmed destruction of 4 strategic bombers would have been preferable if direct aircraft strikes had been feasible. Others contended the infrastructure approach was more damaging long-term. Destroying the fuel system degraded operational capacity more than losing 4 aircraft, because the fuel system served all remaining aircraft while the lost aircraft were irreplaceable. The regiment's planners, in choosing infrastructure over hardware, were thinking in terms of systemic degradation rather than body count. They wanted to make the base unusable, not just smaller. The evidence suggests they were right. Engels-2's reduced operational tempo in the weeks following the strike was documented by OSINT analysts tracking Russian cruise missile launches against Ukrainian targets. the launch cadence from long-range aviation dropped measurably. Ukraine's air defense networks, which had been tracking and documenting Russian cruise missile launches throughout the war, recorded a reduction in total missiles launched from the Engels-2 sector. The surviving aircraft had been dispersed. The fuel infrastructure was being rebuilt. The remaining ground support was strained. Ukraine's cities saw a corresponding reduction in cruise missile pressure from that threat axis. The bombers that had been operating from Engels-2 were destroyed, damaged, dispersed, or constrained by degraded base infrastructure. The 383rd UAV Regiment had purchased Ukrainian civilians time and safety through a strike 1,200 kilometers inside Russian territory. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. The lessons of Engels-2 are operational, strategic, and doctrinal. At the operational level, the strike showed that sequence saturation against a defended point target was more effective than a single high-value strike. The regiment's decision to dedicate 4 drones to the fuel complex, rather than distributing strikes across multiple target types, maximized the probability of achieving catastrophic rather than repairable damage. The sequencing was crucial. The first strike triggered the response, the second and third overwhelmed it, and the fourth, arriving after a deliberate delay, prevented recovery. At the strategic level, the operation validated Ukraine's doctrine of attacking support infrastructure rather than frontline assets. Russia's strategic bombers were defended at the aircraft level. Hardened revetments, dispersal, air defense coverage. They were not adequately defended at the infrastructure level. By identifying that asymmetry and exploiting it, Ukrainian planners achieved effects disproportionate to the resources invested. 4 drones, 19 hours of combined flight time, against 800 million to 1. $2 billion in aircraft, plus the fuel complex, plus the suppression vehicles, plus the disruption to Russian long-range aviation's operational tempo. At the doctrinal level, Engels-2 changed how both sides thought about sanctuary. Russian strategic aviation had operated under the assumption that depth meant protection, that 1,200 kilometers of Russian territory between the base and the front provided a security buffer Ukrainian capabilities couldn't bridge. That assumption was shattered. For Ukrainian planners, the lesson was the opposite. Depth was a solvable engineering problem, not a strategic barrier. And for Russia's long-range aviation commanders, the operational environment became permanently more complex. Every remaining Tu-95MS now flew under the awareness that Engels-2 had happened. Pilots knew it. Ground crews knew it. Base commanders knew it. The psychological weight of that knowledge, that the sanctuary was gone, was an additional burden that no dispersal protocol or upgraded air defense coverage could fully eliminate. Now for the answer to today's tactical quiz. The drone platform used by the 383rd UAV Regiment in the Engels-2 strike was a custom regiment-developed airframe, option C. While media reporting and OSINT analysis noted characteristics consistent with previous Ukrainian long-range drone strikes, the specific technical specifications of the 383rd's operational platforms remain classified. What confirmed assessments have established is that the airframes were not off-the-shelf commercial conversions, but purpose-built strike platforms with extended-range fuel capacity and terminal guidance sufficient for precise targeting of point infrastructure. Building a purpose-built, one-way strike drone capable of reaching 1,200 kilometers and hitting a specific building on a defended airbase represents one of the most significant military-industrial achievements of the Ukrainian defense establishment in the war. And the answer to the second question, 7 storage tanks confirmed destroyed at Engels-2, out of 11 total in the complex. 3 questions to take with you. Was targeting the fuel infrastructure rather than the aircraft directly the right tactical choice? Given the option to strike only the aircraft revetments or only the fuel complex, the regiment chose fuel. The fire spread to the aircraft anyway. But if the wind had been different, the apron might have survived. Was the infrastructure-first approach tactically sound? Or was it an unnecessary risk? Could Russia have prevented this with better early warning coverage? The drone was detected at 14 kilometers, less than 5 minutes from impact at cruise speed. Detection at 50 kilometers might have allowed an effective intercept. Does the failure at Engels-2 represent an air defense gap Russian planners should have anticipated? Or was the terrain-following low-altitude approach fundamentally unsolvable with the assets available? What would you have done differently as the Engels-2 base commander when that first thermal contact came in at 14 kilometers, 11 seconds before the alarm started sounding? Comment your answer. We read every one. Subscribe to ConflictEast, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Engels-2 apron is quiet now. The fire crews left. The investigators finished. What remains are the outlines of 4 aircraft in the satellite imagery. scorched hard stands where strategic bombers once sat fueled and ready, surrounded by the infrastructure that fed them. They're a reminder that in modern warfare, sanctuary is an illusion, depth is a solvable problem, and a regiment with the right engineering, the right intelligence, and the right sequencing can reach any target on Earth. Stay vigilant.